kuntigi gendarme Assimi Goïta ale de an bila ka na an teriw an balimaw an baarakɛɲɔgɔnw n'o ye Niger jamana kuntigi ye a ye citerne 82 gasoil essence.
The room went silent before the words even finished echoing. For million leaders. For a moment, no one at the long polished table in Abuja moved. Not the ministers, not the generals, not the advisors who had spent weeks rehearsing this crisis behind closed doors. The air conditioning hummed softly, indifferent to the weight now pressing on every chest in the room. Niger had crossed a line, not with soldiers, not with missiles, but with fuel. And in West Africa, fuel was power. Fuel was survival. Fuel was war without gunfire. The news had arrived just before dawn, slipped through encrypted channels and half-denied intelligence briefings. A convoy, massive, deliberate, unstoppable, had begun rolling south under the cover of darkness, engines muted, lights dimmed, escorted by armed units who asked no one for permission. Tankers stretched for kilometers, a steel serpent moving across borders that were suddenly meaningless. Destination, Mali. In the streets of Bamako, people had not slept. They had gathered in clusters around radios and glowing phone screens, whispering prayers and rumors into the humid night. Fuel shortages had strangled the city for weeks. Hospitals rationed power. Military vehicles sat idle. Generators coughed and died in the heat. Sanctions had done what bombs could not, slowly suffocated daily life. Then the message spread like fire. Niger was coming. In the presidential palace in Niamey, the decision had already been made long before ECOWAS learned of it. The men who ruled from behind reinforced walls understood the risks. They understood the threats. They understood that once the fuel crossed that border, there would be no turning back. But they also understood something else. This was not just about Mali. It was about who decides Africa's future. The Nigerian leader stood alone by a window as the sun rose, painting the sky in colors that felt almost mocking. His advisors had argued until their voices cracked. Sanctions would come, they said. Isolation would deepen. ECOWAS would rage. Foreign capitals would call this reckless, dangerous, unacceptable. He had listened. Then he had nodded once. Send it. Because if Mali fell completely, if its engines stopped, if its army froze, if its people broke, then Niger would be next. And after Niger, the rest would follow. Piece by piece. Country by country. Sanction by sanction. This was not charity. This was strategy. By the time ECOWAS leaders assembled for an emergency session, the fuel was already moving. Phones rang unanswered. Messages went unread. Flights were delayed as officials scrambled to reach secure rooms. The bloc that once spoke with authority now spoke in overlapping voices, each carrying fear disguised as outrage. How did this happen? Who approved this? Do they understand the consequences? The truth hung unspoken. They understood perfectly. In Brussels, analysts stared at satellite images refreshed every few minutes. In Washington, briefings were rewritten mid-sentence. In Paris, old assumptions cracked quietly under the weight of a new reality. Alliances were shifting, not with declarations, but with diesel and gasoline poured into the arteries of a sanctioned state. Fuel did not care about press releases. Fuel moved. Along the border, soldiers watched the convoy pass with expressions that betrayed nothing. Orders had been given. Routes secured. Anyone who interfered would be treated as a hostile actor. The message was clear without being spoken. This will go through. In Mali, a young mechanic named Amadou stood beside an empty fuel drum, listening to the distant rumble long before he saw the trucks. He had closed his workshop weeks ago. No fuel meant no work. No work meant no food. His children slept hungry too often now. When the first tanker crested the road, he felt his knees weaken. People poured into the streets. Some cried openly. Some raised clenched fists. Others simply stood still, afraid to believe. This wasn't just fuel. It was defiance delivered on wheels. But hope, like fuel, attracts fire. Inside ECOWAS headquarters, voices rose. Sanctions had been designed to isolate, to punish, to force compliance. Niger had just punched a hole through that strategy with surgical precision. And if Niger could do this, others might follow. That was the real fear. Not Mali surviving, but the precedent. A general leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. If we allow this to stand, the bloc loses all authority. A diplomat shot back. If we escalate, we fracture the region. Silence followed. Everyone understood both were right. In Niamey, intelligence reports began arriving in rapid succession. Diplomatic pressure, threatened aid cuts, quiet warnings disguised as concern. Niger's leadership read them without visible reaction. They had anticipated this too. What they hadn't anticipated was how quickly the streets would respond. Crowds gathered in Nigerian cities, waving flags, chanting slogans that spoke of unity, sovereignty, and long-buried anger. For years, people had watched decisions about their futures made in rooms thousands of kilometers away. This felt different. This felt like choosing their own path, however dangerous. In Mali, military commanders watched fuel gauges climb and recalculated everything. Patrols resumed. Logistics chains restarted. The silence that sanctions had imposed was broken by engines roaring back to life. But with movement came tension. Foreign surveillance drones lingered longer. Advisors asked sharper questions. Warnings became colder. Everyone knew that fuel could just as easily become a trigger. Late one night, as the last convoy rolled through, a single message reached ECOWAS leadership from an unknown channel. This is not an act of aggression. This is an act of survival. No signature. No denial. The room where the message was read felt smaller afterward. Because survival has a way of justifying things treaties never can. In the following days, news outlets framed the story carefully, cautiously, selectively. Analysts argued. Pundits speculated. Official statements avoided the word defiance, but danced around it endlessly. Yet on the ground, ordinary people spoke plainly. They chose us. They remembered we are neighbors. They refused to let us die quietly. But others whispered darker thoughts. What comes next? Sanctions tighten. Borders harden. Aid freezes. Pressure mounts. Niger feels it immediately. Currency strain, trade disruptions, diplomatic cold shoulders. The cost of the decision begins to bite. Still, the fuel keeps flowing inside Mali. And every engine that turns is a reminder that power does not always come from weapons or money. Sometimes it comes from refusal. Refusal to obey quietly. Refusal to isolate neighbors. Refusal to let a region fracture on someone else's terms. In a secure room somewhere far from West Africa, a strategist stares at a map now covered in red annotations. Old playbooks no longer apply cleanly. Influence is leaking through cracks no one bothered to seal. This wasn't supposed to happen. Niger wasn't supposed to lead. Mali wasn't supposed to survive this long. ECOWAS wasn't supposed to look uncertain. Yet here they were. On the final night of the operation, as the last tanker disappeared into Malian territory, a Nigerian officer turned to his men and spoke softly. History will decide what this was. He didn't say whether history would be kind. And maybe that was the most unsettling part. Because the fuel had arrived. The message had been sent. And the region would never quite be the same again. What followed would not be announced with sirens or speeches. It would unfold quietly, in boardrooms, in barracks, in markets, in the minds of leaders who now understood that the old order could be challenged not by force, but by solidarity. Whether that solidarity would hold or explode was a question no one could answer. And that uncertainty now burned brighter than any flame.